Morning, everyone. Welcome to Dyslexia and Literacy, Oral Language Connections to Reading and Writing. I am Joan Mealy McCarthy, and I will be your moderator for the day. I've been working with Will Baker and the Dyslexia Foundation for several years to design these one-day conferences to bring science to practitioners, to truly make this effort a research practice, one for children who struggle with reading and literacy. My daily work is as executive director of the Summit School in Edgewater, Maryland, just outside of Annapolis. And I must tell you that my staff and I benefit all the time from the work of the foundation. I want to welcome educators and parents and sponsor schools. Typically, we would be gathered together in person in a beautiful auditorium, and we would be also live streaming all over the country. But it's a different day and time right now, and we are resilient, so we are all gathered on the grid. But we are very excited to be here and very grateful for MGH Institute to be hosting us with this virtual webinar. I hope that we have on the grid parents of children who struggle with reading, and educators and speech language pathologists, psychologists and social workers, and school administrators and medical practitioners. There is something in this conference from anyone who works with or has any connection to children who struggle with literacy. I'm so honored to see such a diversity of people here gathered just for the sole purpose of helping children. And the fact that you are here says that you understand our job is to do whatever it takes to help children become literate and to take their place in the world. And the need for us to do something is compelling, it's urgent. TDF hopes that today's experience will help each of you help children who struggle academically, even if it's one child at a time. Each year, we cover a topic that's relevant to educators and families and that is cutting edge in nature. We want our participants not only to learn something new, but to begin to think about what they know in an expanded way. That's why we present the neuroscience to set up the day, followed by the strong research that will support the practical application discussed in the afternoon. Today's conference is made possible, as I mentioned, by the Dyslexia Foundation, founded by Will Baker, a very smart, dedicated adult who has dyslexia. He founded this organization to help teachers and families help children learn how to read so they won't struggle in school the way he did. TDF is a nonprofit organization and depends upon member dues and participation in these events. Today, on behalf of Will, I would like to thank Dr. Tiffany Hogan and her research lab manager at MGH Institute, Mary Rasner, for partnering with us and hosting this conference virtually. I also want to recognize Rachel Norton, a graduate student in speech language pathology at MGH Institute, for helping with the administrative efforts for today. And I would also like to thank Lauren Jones, who's the executive assistant at the Southport School, for organizational and administrative support to make this day happen. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsors who partner with the Dyslexia Foundation so that these one-day conferences can be a reality. Dr. Bonnie Singer. She will be talking about when written language gets jumbled, the influence of executive functions on reading and writing. Dr. Singer is a speech language pathologist whose service varied clinical, teaching, and administrative work. She is the founder of Architects for Learning, a firm that includes direct service to children and families, as well as professional development for speech language pathologists and other educators. She has designed evidence-based, systematic instructional approaches and scaffolds for the teaching of literacy, especially expository writing, that integrate explicit support for executive and self-regulatory functions. She has authored the Writing Assessment Toolbox, a set of measures for assessing student writing. Empower, an instructional approach to teaching expository writing. Brain frames, graphic scaffolds that depict the relationships between thinking and language. And most recently, an innovative method for teaching sentence comprehension that accommodates students' verbal working memory limitations called unlocking sentences. Her work bridges the gap between research and practice, using research as the foundation to her clinical instructional methods and for her groundbreaking frameworks for her understanding for the intricate relationships between language, executive functions, self-regulation, working memory, and anxiety. She's a consummate teacher, as demonstrated by her clinical teaching at the university level, and as a master trainer for written language and comprehension. Her training credentials are broad and deep, demonstrating national and international reach, and we are very, very proud to have her join us today. Thank you. Dr. Singer, turn on your mic and your camera.
Hi there. Hi, Joan. I think I'm blushing. Thank you. Let me just pull up my slides here and get this going. I just want to say thank you to Will, the Dyslexia Foundation, Joan, all the speakers who came before me, Tiffany, Mass General, for sponsoring this and doing all the legwork to get this going, and an incredible thank you to my longtime research partner, Dr. Bashir. It's been over 20 years since we've really started working together, after he sat me down after I finished my dissertation and told me I studied the wrong thing for the last 20 years. So since then, we've been on the right path together, and it's been a joy. So my goal today is to add on to where he just took you on the journey of listening and speaking, and flip into the realms of reading and writing, and help to really, from the ground view of what is this thing called reading and executive control and working memory, and how does this all come together, and give us more of an experiential understanding of these concepts and what it's like to be a kid. Through that, I'll throw in some implications for teaching. We only have an hour, so really trying to be quite strategic there. My goal is to connect some dots for you, and perhaps some dots that you don't see. So I want to start out with an invitation to read together. And before I show you what we're going to read, I'm just going to ask you, on a scale of 1 to 5, how anxious does that make you feel? Probably most of you, you're all here, you're adults, you're literate, you can decode, you're probably like, oh, I'm a 1, no big deal. Great, so let's set some parameters then for what's going to happen as we read. There are some rules. You can only read this one time. And after you read, you have to answer 3 questions. And if you don't answer them accurately, there'll be severe, severe consequences. Now, how anxious are you? Maybe you've moved from a number 1 to like, well, what kind of consequences? What can she do to me? I'm home in my pajamas. Whatever. Just go with it. Now you can read along with me. Whoops. Sinusoidal pattern of blackening on P that quantum mechanics predicts proves to be the identical to the interference pattern that is observed in Young's double slit experiment. This experiment established that light is a wave phenomenon because the wave theory could readily explain the existence of the interference pattern. It's natural to infer from the existence of the sinusoidal pattern in the quantum mechanical case that particles are manifestations of waves in some medium. There's much truth to this interference, and at an advanced level, this idea is embodied in quantum field theory. However, in the present context of non-relativistic quantum mechanics, the concept of matter waves is unhelpful.
Bonnie, can you put your slides up?
Where are you on your pain scale?
Bonnie, can you put your slides up? We're not seeing your slides.
You're not seeing my slides?
No.
Okay, hang on. Thank you for telling me. Now are you seeing my slides?
Yep, got them.
Big? You see them big?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Oh, goodness. Thank you, Joan. I would have just kept talking and talking and not known that. Little frontal lobe support helps a lot. So if we look at this text now, it helps to look at it. And you experience what it is to read that. Lori's entire presentation from this morning just came to life for you. You can't do this without a tremendous amount of effort, without a tremendous amount of holding, without trade-offs, without managing some emotional fallout and just like, ugh, forget it, I don't even know what she's talking about. It's beyond you, much of it. And so to read expository text, and for some narrative text, you can't not have your executive system really involved. And just because you can decode doesn't mean that you've got everything you need. So if we go to our comprehension check now, and we ask, see how you do. What was the purpose of Young's experiment? How did the authors infer? What did the authors infer from Young's findings? And do quantum mechanics and non-relativistic quantum mechanics view the importance of matter waves similarly or differently? Maybe you got one of these. If you're me, you got 0 of those correct. And so let's just look at what it takes to read that, because it's a lot more than just decoding. So we look at, yes, you have to have decoding ability, you've got to have speed and accuracy, and we see the importance of the executive system so clearly from Dr. Cunning's work. But you also have to have word and concept knowledge, including multiple meanings. So there are lots of multiple meanings within that text, and in the context of quantum mechanics, that makes sense. If you're not someone with that deep background knowledge, those words may be foreign to you, or at least those multiple meanings may be. Grammatical knowledge comes on board, syntax, morphology, where the boundaries are around some of those complex sentences with 3, 4, 5 embedded clauses within them. Your ability to visualize the information certainly comes on board, and hold an idea, connected to an idea, connected to an idea, to be able to integrate the ideas and build comprehension of the text as you go. To integrate all the information that's actually in the text, along with information that you may have some background knowledge, if you happen to have any about this topic, and reason and make predictions and infer things and engage some theory of mind. So there's an awful lot for that coordinating part of your brain to do to keep all of these balls in the air and flowing smoothly. And metaphorically, a single snowflake can cause a 6-car pileup. Any one of those things can be disrupted, non-automatic, and cause all the balls to come crumbling to the floor, kind of causing a massive crash. So let's take another pass at this and read this one. Scientists recently discovered an unusual looking creature with spiked hair in the mountains of Tanzania, a country located in East Africa. The long-tailed tree-dwelling monkey is a highland mangabey. It's covered with brownish gray fur and has an off-white belly and tail. The new monkey makes a honk bark call. See how you did on your comprehension now. What's that text mainly about? And what does a mangabey monkey have in common with a dog? And could the mangabey monkey survive on the coast of northern Maine? So when we look at passage 1 and we look at passage 2, passage 1, all of those questions I gave you were explicit. They were right there in the text. All of the passages in passage 2, all the questions were implicit, and they all required inferencing. And I'm not sure what happened to the words in the text, but they disappeared off my screen. So just because the question is explicit doesn't mean the comprehension is easier. And just because the questions are implicit doesn't mean the comprehension is harder. It depends on all those other balls and how smoothly all those other balls are being juggled and coordinated and pulled together as to whether you can answer an explicit question accurately or an implicit one. There's a lot of must-haves for reading. You do have to be able to decode. And if decoding multisyllabic words is hard for you, some of those words in the first text are going to be very difficult to access. Sinusoidal, experiment, mechanics, all of those have complex phonic patterns. And if you are lacking in your understanding of morphology, those suffixes, ing, all, ens, ed, a possessive, those are going to be lost in you, and the grammatical meanings behind them. And if your word knowledge is lacking, your vocabulary, and you're not appreciative of what the word pattern means in the context of that text, or the word blackening means, or what a P refers to, or a double slit. And if you don't understand relative clauses, that passage is filled with them. Just the syntax alone is going to keep you from being able to access the meaning fluidly. And then along in your executive system, your inhibition has to kick in. You've got to keep your mind from wandering and starting to wonder, what am I going to make for dinner? And do we have any cheese in the fridge? And you've got to stay self-regulated and keep yourself from getting too frustrated and just, pitching a fit and giving up, and holding your attention to something that's challenging, and your capacity to add chunk after chunk after chunk after chunk of brand new information, trying to integrate all the way as you go. It's tremendous executive demand in this frontal control system that Urban's been talking around all day. Everything has to come on board and be coordinated. This is sort of like a kind of statement, but you can't remember what you're not paying attention to, and you're not going to understand what you can't remember. So this connection between working memory and attention is a really, really important one. We've all had moments of sitting in class looking like that. I remember some. And we've all had students who look like that on some days, and basically walk away from those lessons realizing, maybe he got 50% of what I was saying, and a good chunk of it didn't go in. So we really have to be very conscious of that sensitive relationship of attention to the whole executive system, and particularly working memory. Because we know some stuff about working memory from research, and we know how critical it is to language comprehension and expression, just as Dr. Bashir just helped us to understand. But this notion of time limitations is an important one. Stuff sticks on your little mental whiteboard for about up to 30 seconds before I used to have a student who'd say, it disappeared. It just vaporizes. It's as if there's disappearing ink, and after about 30 seconds, it fades, unless you can connect it to something, anchor it to something, do something with it, integrate it with other known information. We have a really, really short window of time to grab onto information and make sense of it before it fades. We also have just a limited bucket, a limited number of things that can fit on our mental whiteboard that we call working memory. It's 4 or 5 chunks. So the size of the chunk makes a difference. And that has huge implications for how we teach reading, how we teach grammar, how we teach kids about language. If we're going to say article, subject, verb, predicate, direct object, indirect, there's more than 4 or 5 chunks. You can't take a 48-word sentence and have a kid go word, 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 and try and do grammatical analysis. You just blow out their working memory. But if you can begin to recognize language as consisting of multi-word units of meaningful information, longer chunks that work together as a team to convey meaning, then we can handle longer sentences, and we can handle longer passages. Visualizing helps information stick. It was a lot easier to picture that passage on the manga bee monkey than it was the passage from a quantum physics textbook, because I know what a monkey looks like, and I kind of have an idea in my head about what East Africa is like and what trees are, and all of those things help my verbal working memory by assembling some visual that it can tack onto. Dr. Bashir talked about this a lot. The more you know about language, the easier it is to hold information in mind. My best example is if you go to a foreign country and you ask someone, how do you say good morning in Thai? They'll say it, and because those sounds are foreign to you, because I don't speak Thai, so I'm trying to map onto my working memory a completely different sound system. And so they'll say it, and I'll say, can you say it again? What? What? And you need to hear it 2, 3, maybe 4, 5, 6 times before some foreign sound system begins to be able to stick long enough for you to be able to repeat a word. So the more you know about words, the more you know about sounds, the more you know about grammar, the easier it is to hold information in your head. And as I said, you've got to have attention on board. You're not going to remember what you're not paying attention to, and it's really hard to pay attention to stuff that you can't remember. So the point of all of this is that understanding what we read takes an enormous amount of effort when there are vulnerabilities anywhere within that pool, within the language system, within the attentional system, within the executive system. And thank God we have an executive system, because that does all the coordinating, that does all that helps to integrate and helps keep all those balls juggling smoothly. So what does this mean for treatment? What do you do with kids who really struggle in these realms? And there are really 3 concepts that I want to share with you that we can gather from what we know about research. One is that it really helps to have kids stop and do something active every X number of sentences, paragraphs, sections of texts, pages, whatever. You've got to figure out what's the right length of chunk, because we really have to combat this tendency for mind wandering. And for kids who have attentional vulnerabilities and executive vulnerabilities, mind wandering is a major, major impediment to comprehension. The best antidote to mind wandering when you're reading is doing, is engaging, is stop and make sense. Make a margin note, make a gist statement, make a brain frame. Do something active that forces your brain to pay attention to what it is that you just read, and integrate the information and figure out where you fell off the rails in your comprehension and do some repair. So that might look like something like this. We use thought bubbles a lot with kids, and this sort of a steal from some ideas put forth by Chris Tovani, who wrote a book called I Read It, But I Don't Get It, which is like one of the most brilliant books about reading ever written. I read it, but I don't get it. Fantastic, particularly if you work with older students. But this, she uses a different methodology. We sort of adapted it with a graphical symbol called a thought bubble that we use a lot in our work with students. But you can see this kid is engaged with this text. I read a little bit, it makes me wonder this. I read a little bit, I have this thought. I read a little bit, and this comes to my mind. And all of that interaction keeps the child completely engaged in the text. Second implication for intervention is that we really need to help kids anchor information outside their head, because inside their head disappears before they can do anything with it. Dr. Bashir made mention of the term brain frames. Brain frames are a set of graphical strategies that he and I started developing a bazillion years ago in response to that student that he talked a lot about, who was having trouble regulating his talking. They're just ways of teaching kids how language works, what the patterns of language are, and how we can visualize them. So this is just a simple graphical representation of about 15, 20 pages of a high school social studies text for an AP student. And as he's reading, he's figuring out what is the author doing in this chunk of text and how can I draw this so I keep it outside my head. It's also a lot easier to study. Whether you use a brain frame or you use mind mapping or you use sketch notes or you use stick figures or you use some kind of visual system, it doesn't matter. But what is really helpful is to anchor information outside so that the thought stays still. The third implication is we really want to help kids increase their insight into when their comprehension is failing and why their comprehension is failing. And we do that in 2 steps. First is just noticing when. There are some kids who are terrible at comprehension monitoring. They're reading along, what they're reading doesn't make sense. They don't even notice that it doesn't make sense. They're working so hard at decoding that they're just not paying attention to whether the words coming out of my mouth are actually sensible words and whether that what I said makes any sense. So there's a wonderful paper that was originally published in the mid-'80s and then redone by Vaughn and Klinger in the late '90s. They reference a technique called click or clunk. We've had a lot of success with click or clunk as a technique for helping kids become better comprehension monitorers while they're reading. So basically how this strategy works is you put a bunch of we start with single words on a stack of note cards, and the kid picks a card, and if it's a real word, he says, click, I know that word, that's an obvious word, it could be like bed, cat, shoe, duck, things that are not difficult words. Or a nonsense word. And if it's a real word, it's a click. If it's a nonsense word, it's a clunk, and you just sort and make piles. So we start with just regular words and nonsense words, just single words, and then move to sentences, same concept. Read a sentence. Is this a click or a clunk? Complex houses marry single soldiers and their families. Clunk, doesn't make sense. And something that might be really, really long or grammatically difficult to parse or grammatically incorrect. So we want a variety of sentences that make sense and are grammatically intact and some that aren't. And then just make a pile. It's a click or it's a clunk. You don't have to really figure out why yet. You just want to notice that feeling of what does it feel like when something clicks and you understand versus clunks. You can move to text then. And you want to make sure you've got some clunk kinds of sentences in the text, so it may be a little bit above their reading level. At the end of each sentence, we stop and say, was that a click? You understood the sentence? Or was it a clunk? And all you do is tally. You don't even get into why was it a clunk or what kind of clunk or what caused the clunk. You just, it's a click or it's a clunk, sentence, sentence, sentence. You just want to increase their accuracy at noticing, I got this, I understood it, or I didn't understand it. When they understand it, they say the gist of the sentence. I understood that, basically it's saying this, and we move on. Then we layer in why it's a clunk. And so they read a sentence, it's a click, great. If it's a clunk, now can you figure out why? And you may have a menu which is 2 or 3 reasons, and that may become more complex, but maybe the sentence was too long, maybe I can't understand the words, maybe I wasn't paying attention, my mind wandered, whatever. Just can you start to figure out what the cause of your clunks was? And then you can layer in some repair strategies for those different kinds of clunks, because you don't do the same thing to fix the problem. They're not all the same problems, so you can't use the same strategy to fix them. So transitioning a little bit, and I'm looking at the clock and freaking out, into writing, because I could spend like 6 years talking about the complexity of writing. So let me just start by giving you a little in-class exam. Let's just say you have to do this right now, drop dead and write. That's oftentimes what we do to kids in class. Why did full legal and civil rights for African Americans finally come to be established only in the late 1960s instead of earlier in the century or even in the 19th century? What were the political, economic, and cultural preconditions for this breakthrough? And to what extent were African Americans able to affect the process? And for what reasons did other Americans help them? So if you had to just right now drop everything, answer this, you have 42 minutes until the bell rings. How anxious are you? And what happens to that pit in your stomach when you look at a question like this and you can't parse it, and figuring, first of all, reading it is challenging, and there's some complex sentences in there. So even just accessing what it is I have to do is difficult. How do you start? Notice the self-talk that kicks in. Tony mentioned this before. We've got positive self-talk when we're feeling pretty confident, like, I've got this, no problem, as opposed to like, oh man, I'm totally gonna fail this class. Oh God, I didn't study, what am I gonna do? And we spiral into this rapid deterioration of self-awfulness, right? I mean, it's all happening inside the kid's head. You know kids that look like this. You've seen them. I've seen them. And sometimes you've looked like that in your own educational experiences. We all have. It's not a good thing when a kid looks like that. There's not a good conversation happening inside the head. And one of the things that we know is that language is one of your best tools to combat a sense of complexity, right? We use language to talk ourselves through doing difficult things. So here's my brain picture, Ben. Yours was spinning, mine's not spinning, but when we look at how the brain works for writing, it's just enormously complex. We used to think, and sometimes we have sexy, slides that make us look like, oh, look, talking is here and speaking is here, and other things are in this area of the brain that's kind of largely involved in that. But really, we have a very networked system. And these aspects of language are so interconnected. So years ago, Tony and I published this article. It was sort of derived out of a good amount of the research I did in my doctoral program in preparation for my research on writing. But we were trying to conceptualize what the heck is going on in order to be able to write. And it is an enormously complex process. The metaphor we used was a house. We think of text as something that's constructed actively, and you need a really solid foundation of some stuff in order for things to happen. So up at the top of the house, we have some core processes of things that have to happen inside your head. You've got to have an idea, some inkling of something you want to get out, some plan in there, and generate some language to capture it. And that might not come out perfectly, but language is going to form in your head. And sometimes even right as you are putting pen to paper or fingertips to the keyboard, you revise it internally. And that's calling on your explicit knowledge of how language works and what words mean and what's a better turn of phrase and grammatical accuracy and all of those things. And we're organizing like crazy as we're writing, putting sounds in order, words in order, sentences in order, ideas in order, paragraphs, sections, chunks. And so really central to our ability to do that is your executive system. It's helping us coordinate and bounce between those various cognitive processes, all happening inside your head before even stuff comes out onto the page. And foundationally, we've got an awful lot that has to be coordinated, and everything affects everything. There's arrows going everywhere because everything's connected. We have your reasoning capacity, your IQ, processing speed, how much you know about what you're writing about, your linguistic knowledge, your vocabulary, your grammar control, all of that stuff, your meta awareness of how language is being used, your working memory capacity, your attention. All of that stuff is coming on board. And what we know from published research is that each of those things affects the quality of writing. So generally, kids with high IQs tend to write better than kids with low IQs in terms of writing quality measures. And each of the items here has a research behind it as contributing to writing quality. Tony talked a lot about this, the rhetorical demands of a task, what it means to argue versus describe versus persuade versus tell a story, Those have different demands on your executive system and your linguistic system. And your environment plays a role. I have some college students who really like to write their papers in bars where it's noisy, or are fine sitting in the hallway with, you know, people coming and going. Others are like, I better be in auditorially sealed environment. It has to be completely quiet. Tony had a student in college who used to play theme music depending on what she was writing about. So if she was writing about war, she would play Beethoven. But if she was writing about literature, she might play Enya or something a little more airy. So even though you may have all of these things working pretty well, sometimes there's some kids who just hate writing. They just hate it. Their feelings about it, their affect, totally get in the way. Whether that writing is going to have any weight to it also matters. Your goals for the piece that you're producing, if that's what your entire graduation is going to hinge on, you've got a lot of pressure there. It's going to increase the volume on your anxiety scale, and perhaps be decreasing the volume on your confidence, your self-efficacy of being able to actually get that task done. We know a lot about handwriting thanks to Virginia Berninger's work and her colleagues. Graphomotor skills have a huge contribution to composition quality, and so does how you're writing by pen, by keyboard, by dictation, also influences the quality and how quickly you can get stuff out. So we think of this more as an assessment model, and really you have to put all of this stuff together in order, you have to assess all of these factors in order to really understand what's in the way of the kid. Because any number of those things can go awry at any given time. So we start to look for what's chronically bogging the kid down. And then we've got to figure out what the right interventions are to chronically begin to plug some of those holes within the foundation so that what happens at the top of that model flows a little bit more smoothly. But writing is a juggling act. It's a complete and total juggling act. It doesn't go smoothly. Sometimes we do kids a disservice when we just write things on the board and, you know, we pre-wrote them, you know, in our kitchen table or whatever. So we come into class with this beautiful lesson and model text as if it comes out with no hiccups at all. But normal writing, typical writing, is a wrestling match, and it looks much like this. Whether it looks like that on paper or just internally may vary, but it's not smooth and it's not automatic. Berreiter and Scartamai is one of my favorite quotes ever. They say, to pay conscious attention to handwriting, spelling, punctuation, word choice, syntax, textual conventions, purpose, organization, clarity, rhythm, euphony, and reader characteristics would seemingly overload the information processing capacity of the best intellects. It's astounding that we can juggle that many balls and some other ones in order to write. We're the only species on the planet that is capable of conveying meaning through some kind of external system like writing, and it is profoundly complex and profoundly demanding of your executive system and your linguistic system. Learning to write is hard, and I'm from Boston. Teaching kids to write is wicked hard. We have a really complex system that is made up of language, yes, but a lot more than just language speaking written down. And we're doing some disservice to some of our students by just saying, here, just use dictation software, as if that's going to solve their problem. If they have vulnerabilities in their working memory and in their ability to rapidly online plan and organize their speaking, dictation software isn't necessarily the magic bullet. We may be alleviating the graphomotor demand, but we are way, way, way increasing the executive and working memory demands for writing. So we have to really appreciate this dance of thinking and language. They go hand in hand. Vygotsky said this a long time ago: cognition and language are inextricably intertwined. They're so interwoven, we can't pull these two things apart. But what they do have in common is patterns. And when we can heighten students' awareness of patterns, we can make a dent, because we do better when information is patterned. We do better when we can say, oh, I see what's going on here, than when everything coming at us seems random. And so we need to approach our language instruction as well as our reading instruction and our writing instruction through that lens. And that's very much how Tony and I think about working with kids. So some so what's here, some takeaways for implications for treatment and working with kids, teaching kids who struggle in these realms. The first is you really have to make sure they understand what they're supposed to be writing before you start getting into the how. And that always starts with reading. Generally, it's reading or listening, but there's some task coming in that's delivered to you either in print or through your ears in class. And you've got to identify the assignment demands, the demands of the task, so you can figure out what to bring on board. So there's a doing component, and that's not always apparent to kids, especially if reading is difficult for them. So really helping them parse an assignment, figure out where's the doing in all these words? What do I have to do is really important. And from that, create a picture of what is this going to look like when I'm done? What am I trying to do here? Do I have to write a sentence or 5 sentences or a paragraph or a 4-page paper? How many paragraphs? Multiple sections within my paper? Like, what is the end goal? So when we can create a future picture of the what, then we can figure out what are the steps I need to take to get there in order to figure out the how. So get a future picture before you start. We know that goal setting increases writing outcomes. Steve Graham's research shows that really clearly. So identifying the what and a real clear goal. I'm going to write a nicely elaborated paragraph. You better make sure kids understand what that means. But if that's what they know they have to do, then they can see whether they met that goal or not. And you've got to choose the best strategies for that task, right? Nicely elaborated paragraph means I need to do what? I need to use what? I need to recruit what? What's in my toolbox that I can pull out that's going to help me meet the demands of this task? Second implication is, we really just have to make the invisible visible. Language is fleeting. Tony mentioned this in his talk. Words are gone instantly right after you say them. Certainly gone minutes from now, hours from now, days from now. And so we have to help kids understand all of this invisible stuff that they're being asked to do. Part of that is, what is this process called writing? It's because we put lies on the wall of classrooms a lot, like the writing process, pre-write, write, publish, whatever, right? Like pre-write is what? What do I do when I pre-write? What's pre-write all about? So that's not articulated finely enough for kids who don't know how to get out of the gate. So one thing that we do, and Tony and I have been doing this for 20 years, and the method that we've developed called Empower is really predicated on this concept of, if you know what to say to yourself to get started, you can use that to help you, to prevent you from falling into that rapid cesspool of negative self-talk, right? I had a student once who said, okay, I'm having negative self-talk. Buck up, Gil, buck up. And buck you for having negative self-talk. So you got to demystify what's involved. You've got to help the kid. If somebody was good at doing this, what would they say to themselves first? And let's ask ourselves that question each time we go to get started. And then what did they say? And write the script for the task with the students so that they have something outside of themselves that they can refer to. The second concept, and Tony alluded to this, is that we have to make language stand still. It's so fleeting. Our internal language is, you have a thought and then you're like, oh wait, what was I gonna say? It's just gone. This shows a mishmash of a whole bunch of different strategies. A number of them are called brain frames. They're graphical representations for patterns of language, ways that we use language to get things done. And there's some other graphics that are not drawn, but one of the things you see is that they're all drawn by hand. Kids are constructing a map of their own internal idea structure. We've given them some schemas for how to draw what's in their head so they can get it out. Whether you use a brain frame or you use some kind of thing, the point is get it out of their head and onto the page so they can look at it and say, yeah, that one's good. That idea is pretty good. That one, I don't know. I'm not going to use that. And just toss it. Ideas are like popcorn. Some of it's really good, and some of it are like burned, crunchy parts at the bottom that don't taste very good. Like, you don't want that idea. Get rid of it. So make language stand still is a really, really key concept for kids who struggle, particularly with working memory, where ideas just fall out of their heads before they can use them. It's a really important concept. If students are thinking, they can show it. And if they can see their knowledge, their ideas, that they can manipulate and organize them. And if they can organize their ideas, they can figure out how to express what they know and they understand. That's really critical. That student that Tony was talking about who won his mock law school trial, we worked with him in 1996 and wrote up his article in 1999, I want to say. So a long, long time ago. He's been a trial attorney for the Justice Department in Washington for the last 15, 20 years. And the key to him unlocking all of that blockedness was to be able to see his ideas standing still on the page, figure out how do I make a pattern out of this so I can literally see where I'm going and put one thought after another thought after another thought. And that helped him both with his talking, which was harder for him, but also his writing, which was challenging, but because it was slower, it went a little easier for him. A big idea really is that reading and writing both require a tremendously expert air traffic controller. And when we look at what it takes to do the job of an air traffic controller, we see this as a really apt metaphor for your executive system. It requires spatial awareness, a simultaneous capacity, an excellent memory, respect for authority and the rules, making decisions under pressure, exercising effective personal authority, paying attention to the details, visual motor coordination, teamwork skills, tolerance to frustration, emotional stability, a willingness to accept criticism, and resistance to boredom. The point of both Dr. Bashir's talk and mine is really everything is connected to everything. Sometimes we think in silos as educators, like this kid has some trouble with reading. Let's work on reading, not necessarily remembering reading is connected to listening, and it's connected to talking, and it's connected to writing. And sometimes there are problems in all of those areas. Sometimes some are relatively stronger than others, but we can use where the strengths are to leverage and shore up some of those weaknesses. But really, we've got a language system that is highly integrated, and everything is connected to everything. And cognition and attention and emotions and memory, those influence everything too. Language influences those things in the center. Those things in the center influence all of those 4 domains of language as well. So everything is interconnected. And so what that means is it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem, figuring out what's going on with this kid, because it can be different on different days and at different times and with different tasks, depending on the executive demands and the capacities of that child. So my takeaways, I'm 2 minutes past 3, I'm sorry, but just a few takeaways here. As complex systems, reading and writing are comprised of numerous skills and sub-skills that must be coordinated and work in synchrony. And reading and writing are both influenced and constrained by other cognitive, emotional, and executive abilities, both influenced and constrained. Effective literacy instruction and intervention for children with dyslexia and related language disorders must include explicit support for executive inefficiencies. And support for the executive control system may need to persist long after kids learn to decode and encode language. Sometimes that's the thing that you just can't let go of from a support perspective. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Bonnie, thank you so much. We definitely have some questions for you, and thank you for giving us the time to answer those questions. I think everyone will be happy to get the questions answered. So the first one is, what value, if any, do you see in instructing students in cursive writing to improving their writing fluency and efficiency?
Cursive writing has a good research base behind it. Yes to cursive. You know, is cursive the magic bullet for all kids? Not necessarily. For some kids, cursive is a lifeline. For some kids, cursive is a death knell. The OT in my office for some students teaches them to write in all capital letters because there are only 4 strokes for capital letters. It's like up and down, or you go sideways, or you go sideways, or you've got to do something round. And for some kids, that's all they can handle from a graphomotor perspective. So it's totally functional. Engineers write in all capitals, architects write in all capitals. What's wrong with all capitals if that's gonna be the most legible and most functional? So really what matters the most, and what the research would say, is that it's about automaticity and fluency, because the speed with which you can get ideas out of your head is the gatekeeper to composition quality. So speed and automaticity. So pick the route that's the fastest.
Oh, that's very informative. Yeah, that makes sense. The next question is, skill in handwriting is not being taught in most schools. Also,
No, yes, and going back to what I was just saying, it's a major problem. Like,
yeah,
and when that, you know, it used to be like Tony and I had Sister Alice Mary, right? Like over and over and over. I have beautiful handwriting, but because it was beaten into me, basically. And we stopped doing that when things like, you know, standardized tests came along. And now, because we have a test, we can't take time for handwriting, and it's super problematic. I don't have the answer to that. All I can say is that's ill-informed from a research perspective, because we've got a bunch of kids who are functionally illiterate because they can't hold a pencil. And if we just took time and taught them to hold a pencil properly and got them comfortable with getting ideas out of their head, their writing would be better.
And I can imagine that's even tougher now that a lot of students are remote learning too.
Oh yeah, oh my God. Well, let's not even open the can of worms. Thank you, Dan, for shedding light on how many vulnerabilities we have now with remote learning. It's up to the ante for a lot of kids.
Can you talk about the assessment procedures you use to make a consideration for diagnosis of dysgraphia?
Oh, well, really, that opens the can of worms of how are you defining dysgraphia? And so if you do a Google search of the word dysgraphia, you're going to come up with a whole bunch of different definitions depending on whose perspective you're reading. So my understanding of that term really comes more from Ginger Berninger's work, and Steve Graham, who defined dysgraphia as a transcription problem. It's a graphomotor disorder, not associated to language, ideas, grammar, the ability to plan and organize language to compose. That would fall under language. But some people put those two together, and they think of dysgraphia as, well, he has trouble writing, meaning he has trouble getting ideas out of his head. But his handwriting's fine. Like it's other cognitive and linguistic components that are in the way. So when I think of dysgraphia, I think of graphomotor. I think of handwriting And when I think of writing and composing, I think of language, emotions, cognition, working memory, executive functions, and all of those other systems that inform your ability to put more than one word together and make sense.
That makes sense. Okay, the next one is there a recommended process for parents asking for services? It seems critical that therapy or services needed to be integrated to work across the curriculum. What resources can inform parents in IEP meetings creating executive functioning goals?
Thanks for the hard questions.
Save the tough ones to the end.
Well, this is what I see a lot on IEPs, and it makes me bonkers, is we'll learn executive strategy, we'll use executive strategies 80% of the time. And I'm like, I don't even know what you mean by that. So first of all, which ones? What strategies are you trying to get a kid to use, and to tackle what problem, and where does that problem show up for the kid? And so there are a lot of layers to it. So the way I would say to think about it is to figure out, go back to what Tony was talking about, what are the demands of the task and what supports need to be put in place. And some of those may need to be, here's a strategy to help you, but it also may need to be, you need a person standing next to you, or you need a visual, or you need something that you can reference because you have trouble remembering the steps of the strategy. So we really have to look at more contextualized instruction, which is what Lori was alluding to earlier. You can't just teach executive functions for the sake of teaching executive functions. That's not doing anything. We don't have good outcomes from that. But what are the executive functions involved in reading an assignment and understanding it, being able to break it down independently and identify what it is you need to do? That's probably a routine that you could figure out how to develop for a student and just practice over and over and over until you get something that's more internalized. So I go from really much more of a task analysis perspective than I do what's the magic executive function thing to do.
Okay. Well, we have time for one more question. The question is, I've been observing, let's see, oops, I just lost it. I've been observing readers at the high school level huff and puff their way through presented text over the years. It's become apparent to me that they struggle significantly to grasp the function of various punctuation marks that demarcate clauses they encounter. Are you aware of any research that examines the relationship between awareness and grasp of punctuation marks and reading comprehension? Have you observed a relationship between the two in your research and practice?
I have, and I don't know that it's about the punctuation in particular, although the punctuation is just a signal that there's some grammatical chunk here that you need to pay attention to. So one of the things that we do a lot with kids in older kids is help them understand clause structure. And clauses are hard. Like, first of all, we call stuff really dumb things, like really complicated things, like independent clause, dependent clause. And the kids are like, what? I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, so one of the ways that I think about that is, can we just have some easier vocabulary attached to these ideas of like, what is an independent clause? It's just a whole thought. It's a whole thought. What's a dependent clause? It's a half a thought. And you can't have a half a thought all by itself. It has to be attached to a whole thought. So you have a half a thought and a whole thought. And then now we have a complex sentence, right? So to get kids to be able to identify the chunks, the grammatical chunks within a sentence is, I have had a lot more bang for my buck thinking about it that way than thinking about word level grammar instruction, because we don't have good data from word level grammar. I mean, actually in writing, teaching kids word by word kind of grammar instruction, their writing gets worse. So I would say, think about what the meaningful chunks are of a sentence and try and highlight for kids. Get them better at spotting them and name them really basic things, something really, really basic. So don't have to remember preposition. And I have a PhD in language. I don't know what a past participle is. I have no idea. Intuitively I do, but not consciously. It's hard.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Singer. Appreciate your time